I went into the woods to find peace. Arizona's wilderness, vast and untouched, was my sanctuary. Hunting wasn't just a sport for me. It was therapy, a way to clear my head and escape the pressures of daily life. When I packed my gear and left my phone behind, I felt a calm I hadn't felt in months. No deadlines, no distractions, just me and the forest. By the time I set up camp, the sun was sinking behind the dense canopy. The crackle of my fire was the only sound in the stillness. The stars shone brighter here, untainted by city lights, and the solitude wrapped around me like a warm blanket. But something about the forest felt different. That first night, I dreamed of whispers, low and slurred, like voices spoken through water. I woke up many times, drenched in sweat, but saw nothing. The next morning, I shook it off and headed deeper into the forest. A hunter's instincts don't leave room for fear. Hours passed before I saw it, a weathered, dirt-caked shoe, half buried in the soil. At first, I thought it was just trash. Then, I noticed the bone. It was a foot, still partially wrapped in rotting leather. The flesh had decayed long ago, leaving nothing but skeletal remains. My stomach churned as I crouched down, digging cautiously around it. The earth revealed more bones, leg bones, a spine, fragments of a skull. My hands shook as I realized what I'd stumbled upon. I told myself it had to be an old tragedy, maybe a lost hiker from years ago. That explanation didn't sit right, but it was enough to keep me moving. By midday, I found another body, or what was left of one. A forearm dangled grotesquely from a tangle of roots, its fingers curled as if frozen mid-scream. Nearby, a skull rested on a rocky outcrop, its hollow eyes watching me. My rational mind broke apart as the realization hit me. This wasn't a place of accidents. It was a graveyard, and whoever put these remains here wasn't done. The smell followed me back to camp, a rank, rotting stench that clung to my clothes, my skin, my hair. It didn't matter how far I walked, the scent lingered. That night, as I lay in my tent, the whispers returned. They were louder now, distinct but incomprehensible. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't animals, it was voices. That night, I was finishing dinner when I heard footsteps. They weren't like mine, cautious and light. They were deliberate and heavy, each step crunching leaves and snapping twigs. I killed the fire and crouched low, gripping my hunting knife. My breath came shallow as the steps circled my camp. Then, they stopped. Minutes dragged by. My muscles burned from staying still. Then, I saw movement. A shadow flitting between the trees. A man stepped out into the clearing, dragging 2 large black trash bags. He wore a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. The bags he carried leaked something wet and black, and the air grew thick with that same rotting stench. I watched in frozen horror as he began digging. His movements were methodical, practiced like he'd done this 100 times before. He muttered to himself, low and angry, words I couldn't make out. When he opened the first bag, the pale glint of human flesh spilled out. I couldn't look away. Then, I stepped on a branch. The man's head snapped up, and his muttering stopped. He turned slowly, his face still obscured by the shadows. "Who's there?" His voice was sharp, ragged, laced with fury. My body was frozen with terror. Then, in one horrifying motion, he picked up a shovel and started toward me. I bolted. Forest exploded around me as I ran, branches slashing at my face and arms. His shouts echoed behind me, closer than they should have been. I could hear his boots pounding against the dirt, the shovel scraping against roots as he chased me. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed for rest, but I didn't dare stop. I glanced back once and saw him, not 20 feet behind me, his hood fallen back to reveal wild, sunken eyes and a face twisted in rage. I tripped, hitting the ground hard. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I scrambled to get up. He was almost on me, the shovel raised high, ready to strike. But then a sound split the air, a distant truck horn on the highway. It was enough. He froze, his head snapping toward the noise. At that moment, I lunged to my feet and kept running. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I fumbled with the keys, bloodied and shaking, and barely managed to shove them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I tore down the dirt road, tires kicking up dust. I didn't look back. When I reached the police station, I told them everything. They didn't question me. The look in their eyes told me they'd heard similar stories before, but none had lived to tell them. The Walter Harold Mitchell case gained attention in December 2020 when human remains, including severed body parts, were discovered in multiple locations near Prescott, Arizona, by some hunters on a hunting trip. Investigators traced the remains to a single victim and identified Mitchell, 59, as the suspect. He had owned a business dealing with cadavers for medical research, but reportedly transported body parts after closing his company in Washington state. Mitchell was accused of improperly discarding the remains in the Arizona wilderness. He was arrested and charged with multiple counts of abandoning or concealing a dead body. The case highlighted ethical concerns in the handling of human remains. Hello, I'm Susan Kuhnhausen. I was 51 years old when it happened. September 6, 2006 was a normal day. Just another shift at the hospital. Just another evening alone in my house in Portland, Oregon. I had worked a long, chaotic shift at the ER. It wasn't unusual. Patients flooding in. Everything from minor injuries to life-threatening traumas. After years of nursing, I had seen it all. When I finally made it home, I didn't have the energy to think. I closed the door behind me, locked it, and let out a sigh. The fridge hummed softly in the kitchen, and my tabby cat brushed against my leg. Everything felt normal. I chucked my bag on the floor and went to change in the bedroom. Walking down the hallway, I could have sworn that it felt cooler than normal. It was Portland in the evening, so that meant nothing. I went into each room and turned on the lights, a comfortable warmth that seemed normal for a place like this. Then, I stopped. I was certain that I had already turned on the light in the hallway earlier that morning. I stopped and placed my hand on the switch. My stomach grew a little tight at this moment, with a tiny bit of unease. I rubbed it off.
You're imagining things, Susan.
I told myself, but the feeling wouldn't go away completely. I pushed open the bedroom door and reached for the light. Before I could flip the switch, something moved. A shadow. My brain barely had time to process it before he was there, stepping out of the dark corner of the room. A man. I didn't know him. Older, stocky, his face hard and expressionless. He was holding something. It took me a second to realize it was a hammer. My mind froze, but my body reacted. I stepped back, heart racing. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he said, his voice cold and mechanical. His eyes bored into mine, as if he'd already decided I was good as dead. Instinct kicked in. I screamed and he lunged. The hammer swung toward me and I dove just in time. The air whooshed past my head as the weapon smashed into the wall. Plaster flew everywhere and I stumbled back, adrenaline surging through me. "This is real, Susan. Fight." He came at me again, this time faster. I grabbed the first thing I could, a lamp, and I threw it at him. The base shattered against his shoulder, but he barely flinched. His expression twisted with frustration, and I realized he wasn't just here to scare me. He was here to kill me. I dashed into the living room, my feet sliding on the hardwood floor. He was right behind me, his footsteps heavy and relentless. I could feel the heat of his rage, his presence consuming the space. He swung the hammer again, and I dodged, grabbing a chair and hurling it at him. It barely slowed him down.
What do you want?
I shouted, my voice shaking, but I already knew the answer. He didn't want money or valuables. He wanted me dead. We struggled and he crashed into me like a freight train. I felt myself fall to the ground. His hands went around my neck. I scrabbled with everything, scratched and clawed and kicked. Years of nursing made me strong, and I put every ounce of it into surviving. In the scramble, my hand found the hammer. I wrested it from his grasp. A jolt of adrenaline gave me a power I wasn't aware I had, and I swung it at him. His face twisted in amazement. The first hit stunned him. He was on his knees in the second. He wouldn't stop. Even with blood dripping from his face, he thrust himself at me once again. I shrieked, the mix of fury and fear somehow forming something primeval in me. I struck again, and this time he fell. His body slammed to the floor with a horrific crack. The house grew quiet, except for my panting. I backed up, shaking, bleeding, and barely able to stand. My hands fumbled for the phone and I called 911, gasping out what had happened. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but I could hear the urgency in their tone. Help was on the way. It was only then that I learned the entire truth. The man was a hitman for hire. And who hired him? My ex-husband, Michael. I couldn't process it at first. The man I loved, the man I had built a life with, had tried to have me murdered. But in the end, his plan failed. I fought, I survived, and my attacker never left my house alive. In 2006, Susan Kuhnhausen, an ER nurse from Portland, Oregon, fought off and killed an attacker hired by her estranged husband to murder her. The assailant, Edward Haffey, broke into her home, armed with a hammer. Despite being ambushed, Susan used her self-defense training and sheer determination to overpower him. In the struggle, she managed to choke Haffey to death. The investigation revealed her husband, Michael Kuhnhausen, had orchestrated the plot. He was later convicted and sentenced to prison. Susan's bravery and quick thinking turned a life-threatening attack into a story of survival and resilience. Never in my wildest dreams I thought I'll lose my brother too soon. Kennedy was the joy of our family that kept us together. It all began one evening as Kennedy came downstairs clutching his throat. "It feels like something is stuck inside," he croaked. He was pale and small droplets of sweat beaded on his forehead. Mom, always a worrier, advised him to gargle with salt water and rest. Over the next few days, things began to shift. At first, it was subtle. He stopped cracking jokes, his usual humor replaced by a strange silence. He spent hours locked in his room, refusing to come out even for meals. When Mom knocked to check on him, his replies were curt and cold. "I'm fine." Then one night, I heard him muttering. I was heading to the kitchen for water when I heard whispers coming from Kenny's room. The door was half ajar and I peeked in without hesitation. Kennedy was standing there looking at the ceiling, then suddenly looked at me with wild, red-shot eyes. "You shouldn't be here," he said, hollow as an empty shell. "It's watching." "Come on, man, don't scare me half to death." I teased him, but he made no reply. He didn't even blink. Instead, he went back, staring at the ceiling. The rest of the days went completely crazy. Kennedy was neither eating nor sleeping, and his behavior was getting weirder. One morning, I was shocked out of my sleep by the thumping sound from downstairs. I rushed to the kitchen and found Kennedy attacking Dad with his teeth bared like an animal. "Get out of my head!" It took all of us, me, Mom, and Dad, to pull him off. Kennedy glared at us, his chest heaving, and pointed one trembling finger. "You're all against me," he spat, "but I'll kill you first." That evening, I walked over to Kennedy's room. I wanted to talk to him, thinking it would make him feel better. He was standing at the window, staring at the woods outside. "Do you see it, John?" he whispered, without turning around. "The snake, it's looking at you too." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "Kennedy, there's no snake. You're not well. Let's go get you some help." He turned then, his face inches from mine, and hissed. "You think I'm crazy? You'll see soon. You'll all see." The breaking point came the next morning. Mom's screams jolted me awake, and I bolted downstairs to find Kennedy in the kitchen, holding a knife. "It's inside me!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with desperation. "I have to cut it out!" I tackled him, pinning him on his back and wrestling the knife from his hand. He wrestled like a madman, flailing and kicking with a strength that wasn't human. It took us all to hold him down. Dad pulled out some cable ties, and we fastened him to the bed with his wrists and ankles roped tight. Kennedy shrieked curses in a voice that wasn't his, low and guttural, giving me gooseflesh. I wanted to take Kennedy to the hospital, to make him go see a doctor, but some of our relatives suggested otherwise. They all told my parents that Kenny's possessed, and we must call Priest to save his soul. When Priest arrived and sprinkled holy water, Kennedy let out a laugh that wasn't his. It was deep, guttural, and mocking. "You think you can save him?" he growled. "He's mine!" The priest's hands trembled as he started chanting his prayer. His voice raised to pleading desperation. Kennedy's body convulsed in savage spasms as he let out a scream that did not sound human. Mom clutched her rosary, sobbing, pleading with the priest not to cease, but it was too late. By the third day, Kennedy had stopped eating and drinking. His body grew weaker, but his voice, dark and otherworldly, never lost its strength. Late that night, I stayed with him while everyone else tried to rest. "John," he whispered suddenly, his voice fragile and faint. For the first time in days, he sounded like my brother again. I leaned closer, my heart pounding. "I'm here, Kenny. What is it?" "It's gone," he whispered, his lips cracked and dry. "But I'm dying." "No, you're not," I said, panic flooding my chest. "You're gonna be fine. Just hold on." He smiled faintly. "It never really leaves," he said. That's when I called the paramedics, refusing to listen to anyone anymore, but it was too late. Kennedy was gone, his body still, his face eerily calm. 26-year-old Kennedy Ethe died in August 2016 in London under mysterious circumstances. His family restrained him for several days, believing he was possessed by an evil spirit after exhibiting erratic behavior. They attempted to perform an exorcism instead of seeking medical help. During this period, Kennedy was tied up, deprived of food, water, and medical attention, ultimately dying from a combination of physical restraint and neglect. His parents and siblings were charged with manslaughter, false imprisonment, and causing or allowing a vulnerable adult's death, but were eventually cleared off all charges in March 2019 after a trial.